The day Colton Reeves got fired was the same day his daughter learned what a soup kitchen was. She was 7, small for her age, with pigtails that he never quite managed to get even. He'd picked her up from school still wearing his work shirt, the one with the oil stain on the left cuff he could never fully wash out, and she'd looked up at him with those serious brown eyes and said, "Daddy, why are there people eating outside that church?" He'd glanced over. The St. Augustine Food Line stretched half a block down Meridian Street. "They're having lunch, Peanut," he said. "Can we have lunch there too?" He didn't answer right away. He was calculating, $31 in checking, a full tank of gas at least. Evelyn's school lunch account needed reloading by Friday. "Not today," he said. That was 3 years ago. Colton Reeves was 41 years old and ran an auto salvage yard on the eastern edge of Denton, Texas, the kind of place most people drove past without looking twice. The sign over the gate read Reeves Salvage and Parps. The paint had been fading for 2 years and he kept meaning to fix it. The yard itself was organized in a way that looked chaotic to outsiders, but made complete sense to anyone who actually worked there. Engine blocks lined the east fence. Body panels were stacked by make and year. There was a 1987 Ford Bronco in the back corner that 3 different customers had offered to buy, and Colton hadn't sold it because Evelyn liked to sit in the driver's seat on slow Saturday afternoons and pretend she was driving to the ocean. She was 10 now. She'd never seen the ocean. He'd been running the yard alone for 2 years, alone meaning without a partner, without a cosigner, without a safety net. Before that, he'd had his Uncle Earl helping until Earl's knees finally gave out and he retired to a double wide in Abilene. Before Earl, there had been a different life entirely. One Colton didn't talk about much. One he'd quietly folded up and put away, the way you put away a dress uniform you're not sure you'll ever need again. Most mornings he was at the yard by 6. He made coffee in a percolator that was older than his truck, walked the perimeter, checked the overnight security camera footage on a laptop, balanced on an overturned milk crate, and started whatever the day required. Some days it was pulling parts for orders. Some days it was negotiating with the tow companies who brought in wrecks. Some days it was just keeping the lights on. He picked Evelyn up from school every afternoon at 3:15 without fail. That was the one thing he'd decided when her mother left. Whatever else fell apart, that wouldn't. Diana Hale had been the regional director of commercial development for Tarrant County's largest commercial real estate firm for 6 years. She was 38, precise in the way that people who've had to build everything themselves tend to be. Efficient, controlled, rarely caught off guard. Her office on the 14th floor of the Pinnacle Tower in downtown Fort Worth had a view of the Trinity River on clear days, and on cloudy days had a view of her reflection in the glass, which she found equally useful. She'd grown up in Garland in a house where the heat sometimes went out in January and nobody made a production of it. You put on another sweater, you kept going. That particular philosophy had carried her through a business degree at UT Arlington, 2 years at a mid-tier firm that folded, 3 years building a client list from scratch, and finally the job she had now, the one that required her to be at events she sometimes didn't want to attend, smiling at people she sometimes didn't want to smile at. She was good at it. She was good at most things that required discipline. What she was less good at, though she wouldn't have used this word, was patience. Specifically, patience with people who wasted her time, people who came to professional events underprepared, people who didn't know what they wanted, or who wanted things that weren't realistic, or who occupied space in a room without seeming to understand why the room was there. This was not a flaw she'd ever examined closely. The Denton-Fort Worth Commercial Property Expo happened every March at the Convention Center off Commerce Street, and it was the kind of event that looked impressive from a distance and revealed itself, up close, to be mostly business cards and lukewarm catering. Colton went because he had to. He'd been trying for 8 months to get financing for a second location, a larger lot out near Alliance Airport that would let him take on fleet contracts, the kind of steady government and corporate work that would finally make the business something that could run without him being there every single day. He didn't tell Evelyn why he was going. He just told her he had a meeting. "Will you be back for dinner?" she asked. "I'll be back for dinner." She considered this. "Dad, you're wearing your good boots." "They're my only boots." "They're your good boots," she said, very seriously, and went back to her homework. He drove 40 minutes down I-35, parked in a garage that charged $14, and walked into the convention center feeling exactly the way he looked, like someone who did not entirely belong there, but was not going to apologize for showing up. He had a badge. He'd paid for the registration like everyone else. He found the financing panel session, took a seat near the back, and listened to three men in suits describe loan products in language designed to make the process sound simpler than it was. He took notes on a folded piece of paper. He didn't have a business card holder. He had business cards in his front shirt pocket, slightly bent. Afterward, there was a reception. He went because the financing rep he'd emailed 3 times, without response, was supposed to be there, and he was not going to drive 40 minutes and pay $14 for parking and miss the one person he actually needed to talk to. The reception was in a glassed-in atrium space, full of people in suits holding wine glasses and making the particular kind of eye contact that meant they were assessing your value while appearing to be interested in what you were saying. Colton got a glass of water. He was driving, and scanned the room for the rep. He found him near the far wall and started across the room. He didn't see Diana Hale until he'd already walked into her immediate vicinity, and by then it was too late to reroute. She was standing with 2 colleagues mid-conversation, and she glanced at him the way people glance at something that has appeared where they didn't expect it. Her eyes moved over him once. The boots, the worn edges of his jacket, the slight calluses on his hands that didn't buff away no matter how carefully he cleaned up. It was a fast assessment. She was good at fast assessments. "Excuse me," Colton said, moving to step around her. "Are you with a vendor?" she asked. He stopped. "I'm sorry?" "The vendors are set up in Hall C," she said, not unkindly exactly, the way you'd give directions efficient. "This reception is for registered attendees and invited guests." Colton looked at his badge, then at her. "I'm a registered attendee," he said. Something shifted in her expression, not embarrassment, not quite, more like a slight recalibration. "Of course," she said, and turned back to her colleagues. He kept walking, found the rep. Had the conversation he'd driven 40 minutes to have, it went nowhere. The rep was polite in the way that means no, not now, not for someone like you, and Colton thanked him, put his notebook back in his jacket pocket, and turned to leave. Diana Hale was 3 feet away, talking to someone else now, but she looked up as he turned, and their eyes met for a half-second. "Back to the salvage yard," she said, quiet enough that only he and possibly the person she was with could hear it. She smiled as she said it, not mean, just smooth. The comment of someone who has long since stopped noticing when they're being dismissive. Colton looked at her for a moment. "Good night," he said, and left. He sat in the parking garage for a few minutes before starting the truck, not because he was upset. He'd been dismissed by more decorated people than Diana Hale. He sat there because he was tired in a way that didn't have a clean name. Tired of proving he was allowed to be in rooms. Tired of the gap between what he'd been and what he looked like now. Tired of the fact that the two things somehow were still not the same thing to other people. He drove home. Evelyn had left a plate of reheated pasta in the microwave with a sticky note that said, "Don't forget to eat, Dad." She'd started doing that around the time she turned 9, and every single time it cracked something open in him a little. He ate, he went to bed, he didn't mention the woman in the atrium to anyone. The financing didn't come through. He spent 3 weeks working other angles, called in 2 favors, had a meeting with a credit union in Louisville that almost became something before the commercial loan officer changed jobs and the file went to someone who'd never heard of him. Meanwhile, the Alliance lot was still available. He checked the listing every few days the way you check on something you want badly enough to be superstitious about. Evelyn started a school project on careers. She interviewed Colton for it, sitting across from him at the kitchen table with a printed list of questions. "What do you love about your job?" she read. He thought about it. "Figuring out what's worth saving," he said. She wrote it down without looking up. "What's the hardest part?" "Convincing other people it's worth saving too," he said. She clicked her pen. "That's also a good answer, Dad." He wasn't sure she knew she was describing his entire life. The Veterans Business Forum was not the event Colton had planned to attend that April. He'd gotten an email about it, looked at it, filed it under maybe, and forgotten about it until the confirmation reminder arrived 2 days before, and he realized he'd accidentally registered for it 6 weeks ago, and paid the $50 fee and never canceled. He went. It was smaller than the expo, quieter. The kind of event that doesn't have a glassed atrium and doesn't need one. It was held in a conference center off University Drive, organized by a nonprofit that helped veteran-owned businesses access federal contract pipelines. The room was full of people who, like him, had done a version of their life before this one. Colton did not usually talk about his military service. Not because he was ashamed of it, because it was his, and he'd found over the years that the moment you mention it, people want to put you in a category, and he was tired of categories. He was signing in at the registration table when he heard his name. Not his full name, just Reeves. He turned. The man who'd said it was in civilian clothes, khakis and a button-down. But there was something about the posture that you didn't get from civilian life. Colton recognized him before his brain had fully processed who it was. Rear Admiral James Cofield, retired now apparently. They'd served together, not adjacent to each other, but overlapping, in the particular way the Navy has of placing men in the same current at different times. Cofield had been a captain then, and Colton had been a lieutenant commander, running logistics for a joint operations unit out of Bahrain. They'd spent 4 months working the same problem set. They'd had some long nights and some very short mornings. And Colton had done something in the 3rd month that Cofield had told him he'd never forget. Colton had, more or less, forgotten it. That was the difference between them. "Caulfield," Colton said. They shook hands. Cofield looked at him the way you look at someone you genuinely didn't expect to be standing there. "What are you doing in Denton?" Cofield asked. "Running a salvage yard," Colton said. Cofield studied him for half a second. "Of course you are," he said, "because nothing is ever simple with you." They ended up talking through most of the opening session. Cofield was on the nonprofit's advisory board now, one of several retired senior officers helping root veteran-owned businesses toward government contracting opportunities. He asked about the yard, about the alliance expansion, about the financing gap. He listened the way he'd always listened, fully, without interruption, without performing interest. "You should have led with the logistics background," Cofield said. "I was trying to get the loan on the business merits," Colton said. "The business merits and the logistics background aren't separate things. You ran supply chain for a joint task force in an active theater. That's not a footnote, that's the headline." Colton hadn't thought of it that way. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because he'd been trying so hard to make the civilian version of himself legible that he'd stripped out everything that made him who he was. Diana Hale was also at the Veterans Business Forum. She hadn't planned to attend. She'd been pulled in at the last minute by a colleague who'd had a scheduling conflict and needed someone to represent the firm at a panel discussion on commercial real estate access for veteran-owned businesses. Diana had agreed because she was good at panels, because the topic intersected with her portfolio, and because she'd been at her desk since 6 that morning and needed to be in a different room. She was on the panel from 2 to 3:30. She spoke clearly, gave practical answers, mentioned 3 specific resources that the attendees could actually use. She was good at this. She always was. Afterward, she was gathering her things when she saw him. It took her a moment. The salvage yard. The expo. The comment she'd made. She'd thought about that twice since then, both times briefly, both times in the way you think about something small that has lodged itself without explanation. He'd looked at her and said goodnight and walked away, and she had known, standing there, that she had been unkind in the particular way that unkind people convince themselves is just being direct. She wasn't usually unkind. That was the thing. She was sharp, yes, efficient, certainly, but unkind. She tried not to be that. She could have let him walk past. The room was clearing out, and he hadn't seen her yet. She walked toward him. "Mr." she began. "Reeves," he said. He'd seen her after all. "Diana Hale," she said. "We met at the expo in March." "I remember." "I owe you an apology," she said. She was looking directly at him. She wasn't one for preamble when the thing to be said was clear. "What I said. The comment as you were leaving. It was dismissive, and I don't have a better word for it than that, so I won't pretend I do." Colton looked at her for a moment. He seemed to be deciding something. "Apology accepted," he said. Just like that. Just like that. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Not suspicion exactly, more like a longer runway. Most people needed more time with an apology. "Can I ask what brought you today?" she said. He glanced across the room. "Rear Admiral Cofield talked me into staying for the afternoon sessions," he said. "He says there are federal contract angles I haven't explored." Diana followed his gaze to where Cofield was standing, now talking to a cluster of 3 other attendees. "You know Admiral Cofield," she said. "We served together long time ago." She looked at Colton Reeves then with different eyes. Not better eyes, she would think later. Different ones. The kind that had to recalibrate after assuming too much. "I work with several firms that have GSA schedules," she said. "If you're trying to get into federal contracting, the real estate side matters more than people expect. Facility requirements, location certifications." "I know," he said. "I spent 4 years managing facility contracts in Bahrain." "Stopped. You managed government facility contracts overseas." "Among other things." There was a pause that wasn't quite silence. The room was still moving around them, but felt like it. "I made a very large assumption about you," Diana said. "You made a common one," he said. She didn't argue with that, because it was true, and because she'd spent enough years being categorized herself to know that being on the other side of it wasn't a position to be defended. They ended up talking for 40 minutes. It started as professional, a conversation about contracting and certification and the specific challenges of veteran set-aside programs, and then it became something else around the edges without either of them quite noticing when the shift happened. She asked about the yard. He told her about Evelyn, not all of it, just the important parts, just that she existed, and that she was 10, and that the Saturday mornings at the yard were the best hours of his week. Diana listened the way she listened when she had stopped trying to assess and had started actually paying attention. She had a daughter too, she told him. 8 years old, Margot's. No, different name, Clara. Clara was 8 and currently obsessed with robotics club and had strong opinions about the unfairness of bedtime. Strong opinions in general, Colton asked. And she was approximately 2, Diana said. He smiled. It was the first time he'd smiled since the atrium. He called the next week. She answered, which she later admitted she'd wondered whether she would. The phone call lasted 90 minutes. It should have been 30. They met for coffee the following Saturday at a place equidistant between Denton and Fort Worth, his suggestion, which she noted. He was there when she arrived. He was drinking water, not coffee, because he'd already had 2 cups and told her this up front, which she found more charming than she expected to find it. The coffee lasted 3 hours. "You're different than I thought," she said at some point in the second hour. "You thought I ran a junkyard and couldn't afford the parking," he said. "I didn't say junkyard. Your face did." She looked down at her cup. "My face has a credibility problem," she said. "It's a very honest face," he said. "I find it useful." That was the moment, she thought later. Not the apology, not the forum, not the 40-minute conversation. That moment, when he said something honest and she understood he meant it. 6 months later, the Alliance lot deal closed. It didn't happen the way Colton had expected. It rarely did. Cofield had connected him to a contracting officer with the Army Corps of Engineers who needed a regional supplier with the right logistics clearances. That contract required a larger facility. The larger facility required a business plan that finally made the loan legible to a lender who'd been on the fence. The dominoes took 4 months to fall in the right order, and Colton spent most of that time working the salvage yard in the mornings and the paperwork in the evenings and picking Evelyn up at 3:15 without fail. Diana had helped, not by pulling strings, she was precise about the distinction, but by knowing which rooms the right people were in and making sure Colton knew where those rooms were. Evelyn came to the lot signing. She wore her good sneakers. "Is this ours now?" she asked, standing in the middle of the empty lot, looking out at the flat Texas land. "Ours now," Colton said. She turned in a slow circle, taking it in. "We should get a better sign this time," she said. "We will." "And Dad," she looked at him, "can I sit in the driver's seat of whatever car we put in the back corner?" He put his arm around her shoulders. "Always, Peanut, always." The day Diana told Clara about Colton, she did it the way she tried to do most things. Directly, without too much framing, trusting the 8-year-old to handle information with more grace than adults usually expected. "His daughter's name is Evelyn," Clara said. "That's right. Is she nice?" "I think you'd like her." Clara thought about this. Does she like robots? I don't know yet. That's the important thing, Clara said very seriously. Diana smiled. I'll ask. She texted Colton that evening. Clara wants to know if Evelyn is interested in robotics. He texted back 11 minutes later. Evelyn wants to know if Clara has ever been to a salvage yard. Diana read that and laughed out loud, genuinely, in a way she hadn't in longer than she'd realized. I think we should introduce them, she typed. Saturday, he replied. She looked at the message for a moment. Outside her window, Fort Worth was going dark, the lights coming on one by one along the river. Saturday, she typed back. And for the first time in a long time, she found herself looking forward to the weekend, not for what it would accomplish, not for what it would move forward, but simply because it was coming, and he would be there, and their daughters would be somewhere in the same lot turning circles and figuring out whether they liked each other. And that, Diana thought, was enough. More than enough. It was the beginning of something she hadn't planned and hadn't predicted, and, for once in her very well-organized life, didn't feel the need to map out in advance. She was, it turned out, good at that too. I keep thinking about the moment Cofield said Colton's name across that registration table, not loudly, not dramatically, just Reeves. Like no time had passed. Like a salvage yard in Denton and a joint task force in Bahrain were just 2 points on the same line, which in a way they were. That's the part nobody talks about when they talk about starting over. They talk about the courage it takes to walk into a new room. They don't talk about what it costs to leave parts of yourself at the door just to be taken seriously in that room. Colton had done that. He'd stripped out the Navy, the logistics command, the 4 years of decisions made under pressure in places most people couldn't find on a map, and tried to sell a loan application on a business plan alone. And it almost broke him. Not because the business wasn't real, because he'd made himself smaller than he was, and the world had believed him. I think about Diana too. She's not a villain in this story, and I think that matters. She was someone who moved fast, assessed quickly, and had trained herself so well to read us room that she'd stopped questioning whether her reads were right. The comment she made at the expo, quiet, smooth, almost offhand, wasn't born from cruelty. It was born from a habit of certainty that had never been seriously challenged. The difference between those two things is important, because one can be unlearned, and she unlearned it. That takes something. It takes the kind of honesty that most people avoid, because it's easier to justify yourself than to walk toward the person you dismissed and say the thing plainly. What I find myself sitting with is this. The outcomes in this story weren't accidents. Colton spent years building something real, not just a yard, not just a business, but a kind of character that held up under the weight of single parenthood and financial pressure and the particular loneliness of being underestimated. He showed up. He picked Evelyn up at 3:15 without fail. He drove 40 minutes to a room that didn't want him there and didn't leave until he'd done what he came to do. That's not luck. That's a man who decided at some point that his integrity wasn't negotiable even when his circumstances were. And Diana had the intelligence to recognize what she'd gotten wrong, and more than that, the willingness to act on it. A lot of people reach the recognition and stop there. She didn't stop there. She walked across the room. I think the thing both of them had, underneath everything, was a refusal to become less than what they actually were. Colton didn't perform bitterness. Diana didn't perform righteousness. They both just kept moving forward with their eyes open, and eventually the distance between them closed. That's the part I want to remember, not the Admiral, not the handshake, not the lot closing in April. The quiet daily work that made all of it possible. Evelyn's sticky note on the microwave. The business cards in the front shirt pocket, slightly bent. The 90-minute phone call that should have been 30. The small things were never small. They were the whole story told slowly, one ordinary day at a time.